Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausan Pereira. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Tuesday promised to open the country's economy further and lower import tariffs on products, including cars, in a speech that struck a conciliatory tone on the rising trade tensions between China and the United States. Xi also said China would raise the foreign ownership limit in the automobile sector as soon as possible and push previously announced measures to open the financial sector. The comments sent US stocks futures, the dollar and Asian shares higher. Xi's speech comes amid rising trade tensions between China and the United States following a week of escalating tariff threats sparked by US frustration with China's trade and intellectual property policies. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze China's move to further open its economy. Joining me on the program today are Srikanth Kondapalli, Professor Chinese Studies, JNU, Nitin Desai, former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Ashok Sajjanhar, former Ambassador, and VK Mishra, Executive Vice Chairman, India-China Trade Center. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Professor, I'd like to begin with you. Why has Xi decided to open up the Chinese economy?
Well, there are a number of factors. You see that the global developments after the Russian diplomats who were asked to leave in the US, UK, there has been a sharp decline in the Russian ruble. Secondly, the Trump administration had imposed tariffs on nearly 1,300 items in the Chinese market to reduce the trade deficits. Then there is also the recent 19-party Congress and the two sessions, NPC as well as CPPCC sessions, which reiterated the domestic consumption, innovation, as well as restructuring of the economy from manufacturing to the services. And the 19-party Congress mentioned about a long-term plan till 2050 of sustainable development practices, which also include the how to sustain medium-high growth rates. As you know that the Chinese maintained 14% growth rate in 1992, reduced to about 10% by 2010, but now it's hovering around 6% growth rates. So in order to enhance the growth rates and overcome international kind of challenges, there is a new pattern that is necessary. And I think the 5 areas that President Xi identified at the POA forum are an indication of this urge for reinventing itself, Chinese economy reinventing itself. With the global financial crisis, no longer the China model of export orientation is the answer. So they have shifted in the 12th five-year plan, 13th five-year plan towards domestic consumption. But domestic consumption also faces huge problems because of the agriculture sector, which is not able to consume all the products that China is producing. Premier Li Keqiang suggested to about 40% domestic consumption, as against Indian domestic consumption of nearly 59–60%.
Sure.
So to that extent, I think there is this restructuring that is necessary, and so this is one answer.
Sure. Mr. Desai, how is this going to help the Chinese economy, and what's going to happen in the days to come, do you think?
Well, first, I think it's very impressive that Xi had projected himself as the great spokesman for globalization and multilateralism at Davos. And in many ways, what he has announced is, it's extraordinary that when confronted by a trade war, the country reacts by liberalization rather than restriction. I think more in a broader sense, my feeling is that if you go back to the party Congress, the vision that they're projected of themselves as a leading technological power, particularly, and this is why the heavy investments in things like artificial intelligence and so on, that is not possible unless they also open up the system to be much more open in terms of ideas, in terms of competition, and so on. So it seems to me that this is very much something that they're doing because they are convinced that this is something that is necessary for their particular vision. Second, I think when it comes to the immediate threat, very few people can compete with Chinese manufacturing. Very few people can. Who's going to, I mean, here are the guys who are outselling you everywhere. Now, who's going to go there and outsell them in their own home territory? So I'd say that they don't have to worry too much by opening up the economy, lowering tariffs, and so on. So my feeling is that this is a very shrewd move. It's going to stand them in good stead, and frankly, it's also good for the rest of the world.
Sure.
No?
Sure. We'll talk about how it is good for the rest of the world probably a little later in the program. But let me bring in Ambassador. Now, Ambassador, what is the objective of this move? Is China somewhere deep down worried that some of the other Western allies of the United States and Trump might follow suit and impose additional tariffs on Chinese goods?
You see, my reading of the situation, Frank, is that Mr. Xi Jinping, in addition to whatever has been said, really had his back to the wall. And there were very few alternatives that he really had in his hand. Because if you look at what the situation today is, whether we've had these $50 billion of tariffs that have been slapped by the United States, and then from China, there was a retaliatory move, on the aluminum and steel imports. Then there was the threat of 100 billion additional tariffs. And there also very strongly, very staunchly, China had retorted that they are also going to act in the same manner. But if you look at what the situation is, there is a $400 billion deficit, trade deficit, that the United States suffers as far as China is concerned. What Mr. Trump has also said is, when an American car goes there, it faces only a 2.5% tariff. When the Chinese car comes Chinese automobile, to the United States, it faces only a 2.5% tariff. When a US car goes there, it faces a 25% tariff. Now, even if you look at the trade, the manner in which it has moved last year between the United States and China, the exports, Chinese exports to the United States have increased by about 16%. So the whole situation was becoming unsustainable as far as both politically as also economically. That you can't have a situation where the exports are 550 billion, your imports are only about 140 billion. So about 400 billion of trade deficit as far as the United States is concerned. So it had its really back to the wall, and it thought, without mentioning Trump, what Xi Jinping has said, all the demands that Mr. Trump was making, whether it was in the automobile sector, whether it was in terms of the investment in this sector, in the automobile sector, whether it was in the area of intellectual properties. So these were the basic demands that Mr. Trump had been making. And so these are the things, these are the areas where President Xi would have thought that it is, there is no way out but to give in. But here I would like to also put a rider that, these are the sort of promises that have been made by China many times in the past.
True.
Is he going to walk the talk? Are they going to be? I think there is much greater leeway that is available to China at this moment, that whether it is in terms of trade or even it is in terms of their GDP growth, 6.5%, which is also the target that they have fixed for 2018. I think they have good cushion that they can take it forward, because although their trade surpluses have been coming down from 2016 in 2017, but they still have a very significant, about $422 billion of trade surplus in 2017.
Indeed.
Out of a total export of 2.2 trillion. So I think they have cushion. They do not have, from the world over, there is pressure on them. So I think that was one of the ways to go forward.
So they buckled under pressure and they're moving forward is what you're suggesting. Let me bring in VK Mishra, Executive Vice Chairman, India-China Trade Center now. VK Mishra, has Xi Jinping managed to strike a conciliatory note as far as the tariff war is concerned? We've seen a lot of it happening over the last couple of weeks. Is this a welcome step?
We can't exactly say it is a welcome step, or we should talk in the relevance of India. Then it is certainly going to affect, maybe in few things positively and maybe in few things negatively. Now, if we see the whole history of modern export approach of China, we will not talk beyond 2005 when they have joined WTO. So we can divide in four parts the whole gamut of bilateral trade with China per se with any country. In 2005, the perception was that after joining the WTO, the growth of export from China will reduce. Everyone knows what happened after that. In 2008, when again we divide all over the world, the economic recession was there. We were expecting the big down of the exports from China. And again, after 2014, when President Xi has joined, and within 1 year, he has changed the whole dynamics of exports of China. Now, as a business person, as a chamber person, I see the whole game of China exports now loaded with technology. Nobody can negate the technology addition of Chinese export now. Whether you talk about artificial intelligence, or you talk about internet industry of China, or you talk about any kind of automation in Chinese industry, within a span of 4 to 5 years, the whole industry is changing its face. Now, if we talk about the barriers in terms of any kind of restrictive barriers to Chinese import, the question is demand and supply. If you will not address the demand of your country by making production in your own country, I think long-term solutions are not there. Short-term solutions are there by putting restrictive trade practices, but it will not solve the problem. And your local consumption will start increasing in terms of cost. And if you will not address the production capacity enhancement in your country, whether it is US or it is India, you cannot solve this problem. I strongly have this view with per se to India also, that unless we increase our production, we cannot challenge the imports from China. Same is situation with US now.
Sure.
Now, after having such a big bilateral trade deficit, they have started, but it is too less. Whatever Mr. Trump has done, it cannot really give them very big edge. Maybe my other colleagues differ on this point, but as a businessman, I strongly feel that by just putting anti-dumping, you cannot win, you cannot conquer.
Mr. Desai, as far as India is concerned, how is this going to impact India? How is it going to, what kind of an impact is it going to have globally?
I suspect that certainly in the stuff, there will be some positive impact for Indian exporters, etc. There will be space created for them in China. I don't know whether they have the capacity to fill that space in, but it's certainly it's something which has potential. Well, let me go back to what the motivations may be. Ambassador Sajjanhar may be right that the immediate motivation may be to, in a sense, dissuade Washington from escalating the war further.
So it's a conciliatory note at the end.
There may be a conciliatory note. But I think there is also something else. There's been a general trend of them trying to open up their certain sides of the economy because of this great vision they have that their future lies as a technological power rather than as a manufacturing power.
So they're already looking ahead.
They're looking ahead. Every country has faced what's known as the middle income trap. It's a well-known phenomenon in economics, the middle income trap, which is that when you graduate to middle income, you can no longer can be in the business of taking other people's technology and using it. You have to become at least product designer, process designer. You see this in Korea. Korea today is if you take Korean companies, they are a significant presence.
So is there a lesson for India from this?
I would say the lesson for India is whatever you're doing, do it. That's the most important lesson one can hear from China. Here we will make wonderful thundering statements about nanotechnology and this technology and that technology, but it does not translate into actually things happening on the ground. Now you see in China today, in AI, in pattern recognition, face recognition, they have won awards in the United States. And why? Face recognition is a rather valuable thing for security agencies. It does help them a great deal in certain respects. So this is why they have, the motivation was that. But the fact is, it's widely recognized that they're significantly ahead of, they're the only country which can possibly compete with it. I remember in internet, they are the only country which has been able to create entities which are of global in terms of their scale, market capitalization, etc.
Sure.
In the internet space. Tencent holding Alibaba, Baidu, etc., etc. And the big American majors on internet have virtually no presence in China, partly because of the firewall, partly because of the restrictions, but also partly, I think, they are recognizing the fact that there are many, many, many more Chinese-speaking internet users than English-speaking ones.
Right.
Which they are able to serve. Their focus on the domestic market will serve them, and they're incidentally also moving inland.
Right.
There is a lot of evidence that they're moving inland and starting to develop areas away from the coast, and part of their whole bullet train business was to reach out to the interior areas.
Indeed. You know, Professor, as far as following through is concerned, like Ambassador Sajjanhar said in his opening remark, that these kind of statements have been made by the Chinese in the past as well, but they have not really followed through. What's to say that the same is not going to happen this time around?
Indeed, for example, the fourth plenum of the 18-party Congress in 2014 November mentioned about opening up of the Chinese economy, breaking up of the state-owned enterprises for more efficient management system, and so on and so forth. But the 19-party Congress in October last year reversed the whole thing by pushing the state-owned enterprises to be the global brands in future. So there has been a reversal from the 2014 to the 2017 picture. The current statement about opening up of the Chinese economy and restructuring, the key issue for India is, will the market economy status be observed in the Chinese Chinese situation? For example, will the Chinese open the market for Indian pharma sector, Indian software industries?
True.
Which is a crucial, since 2010 May, when President Pratibha Patil visited China, this has been a constant theme with the Indian establishment that China needs to observe the market economy status. India is losing a lot in terms of trade deficits. From 2007 to 2017, India lost nearly $500 billion in the trade deficits to China. And as a developing country, it cannot afford that kind of huge losses. And hence, this has to be addressed by observing market economy status, by Chinese investments in India. The total Chinese investments in India so far is $4.3 billion for an economy which is the second largest, which is about $13 trillion, and with a foreign exchange reserves of $3.2 trillion, the total investment in India is just about $4.3 billion. So to that extent, I think the investment proportion needs to be increased. When Xi Jinping visited India in September 2014, there was a promise to invest $20 billion in the next 5 years. We are almost finishing those 5 years by 2019. The total investment is $1.2 billion from then, 2014. So in other words, the second issue of Chinese investments in the Indian market have not yet been realized. Thirdly, the tourism has been partly increased from roughly about 1 lakh to about 9 lakhs after the e-visas have been instituted. So this is one area, the opening of the Chinese economy towards the Indian side could also probably contribute. A fourth area, I think, is the Chinese companies coming and putting up shop in the manufacturing sector. For example, Pune and Ahmedabad were identified in 2014, but not much progress has actually taken place in this. So in other words, as the Chinese labor costs are increasing, there is also the push from the Chinese side that they need to go outside and invest. The 2002 going outside is now what President Xi Jinping is trying to implement.
Right. Sure. Ambassador, as far as political impact, what kind of political impact is this move going to have in China, if any?
I think it is going to be welcome because they do have that space to be able to to absorb more of both investments as also goods and services from outside. And of course, they've been trying to focus on the domestic economy, trying to increase its share in the overall GDP of the country. So I think, and it will, the more imports that they are able to make, the more foreign investments they are able to make, the more impact it will have on the lives of the ordinary people. So in that sense, it's definitely going to be welcomed, and there's not a sort of a situation in which they are getting that they will still be able to maintain the trade surplus. So they are, $3.2 trillion. That is the foreign exchange reserve that they have. So they have a lot of room to play with. But let me also come back to the comment that I had made earlier also, that the fact that Mr. Xi, whether it was at Davos, as you had mentioned 2 years ago, that he had projected himself as the champion of globalization and of liberalization. Last year, actually, not 2 years ago, last year in 2017, he was there. And after that, he went to Peru, South America, and, he, because this was just after President Trump having taken over and America first as the policy that he was. This is, he doesn't sound credible because there are so many walls, there are so many barriers to entry into China as far as foreign goods are concerned, foreign products are concerned. Meaning, even if you look at what the bilateral trade volume and levels between India and China are, we say what China has projected $84 billion 2017 is the first time that we have crossed the barrier of $80 billion. But you look at what is the composition. India's exports, they have increased by about 40%, but that's only $16 billion. As far as Chinese exports, they have also increased to $68 billion, so that the trade deficit is still good $50 billion plus, which means that out of the total trade deficit with the whole world that India has of about $100 billion, about 50% is accounted for by China itself. Sure. So it's not that, India does not have products. As has been mentioned, whether it is pharmaceuticals, whether it is information technology, if there are possibilities, or for that matter, even services. And we look at what are our exports to China today. They are diamonds, they are copper, they are zinc, they are cotton yarn, they are sort of, it's like neo-colonial trade linkages. Indeed. So I think China definitely needs to open up to make it sustainable for itself. Because even this sort of a trade exchange, $68 billion where India is importing and $16 billion it's exporting, this getting even more skewed. This is not sustainable. This will not work. So for itself,
I'll just come to you, Mr. Desai. Before that, let me go across to VK Mishra, and then you can have your say. We'll conclude the program with closing remarks. But before that, VK Mishra, what does this say about the Chinese economy going ahead?
There is one very important question we should not forget. Our whatever import is increasing with China, it is also helping us in Make in India program. Whatever import recently has been increased, if we review the 2-digit to 8-digit structure of that import, we will see more than 55% imports from China are for Make in India. Whatever we are assembly lines we are establishing here for telephone, for mobile phones, for LED TVs, for these kind of white goods. And it is not even India, China per se. Now, the Korean companies, Samsung, the Japanese companies, all those companies are heavily depending upon the China component import in India for Make in India. This is very important thought which we cannot avoid while making any kind of opinion about Chinese imports. Number two, the Indian export basket. We are not able to increase our export basket in past 1.5 decades. Our maximum export to China was with the minerals, with the raw materials which we were exporting in past history. So we need to learn with that. We have to have some incremental approach in our production where we need to increase our export basket. What will happen after restrictions imposed by US? A very simple, in past 5 years, China has developed so many markets in SAARC countries. What is happening in our neighboring country? In every neighboring country, Chinese imports are increasing. Chinese services are increasing. Chinese EPC projects are increasing.
Sure.
Be it Sri Lanka, be it Bangladesh, be it Pakistan, be it other SAARC countries. So China is trying to balance its whole export basket. They know something will happen with US. Some restriction will come. They have compensated all those things by increasing these markets.
You know, Mr. Mishra, I've
Where
got
India
limited time, so
stands-
I'm going to get quick closing comments from all my guests because I've got 2 minutes to wrap up the program. In 30 seconds, beginning with you, Mr. Desai.
Well, first, I think with the point which Mr. Mishra made, you must look at trade as in a much more coherent fashion. People mention pharmaceuticals. You know, practically all the precursor materials for Indian pharmaceuticals come from China.
Sure.
The active ingredients in antibiotics, the chemicals, they all come from China. And in fact, we are the gainers because we are getting the source material from there, manufacturing the higher value products and exporting them to the United States elsewhere. So trade has to be looked at in a much more coherent fashion.
Right.
And I would therefore urge that we should look at this as an opportunity rather than as a threat.
Professor.
I think President Xi Jinping's announcement is a welcome step to the also a mid-course correction in the light of the recent changes. But in terms of India, the investments in the infrastructure projects, especially the ability to connect to our interior and to the ports, I think that needs to be emphasized extensively. Number one. Number two, in the manufacturing sector. Number three, also in the infrastructure projects. There are several projects, for instance, the Chennai to New Delhi $36 billion project. It's been hanging with many surveys, etc. Not much progress has
Timely
occurred.
delivery
So
on projects is what you're going
on
to
the
be stressing
infrastructure
on.
projects.
Yes, sure. Ambassador.
Welcome move, definitely. But I think, as I mentioned earlier also, it needs to be seen whether they are going to walk the talk, whether they are going to implement all that is done. As far as India is concerned, this huge trade imbalance deficit is unsustainable, so they need to open their market. And also another way of addressing the huge trade deficit also is for greater Chinese investments into the country, which has not been happening. $20 billion initially when Xi Jinping was coming, they said they'd mentioned $100 billion.
Sure.
That did not happen, $20 billion. But even that is also far from being achieved. So the point I made earlier is promises have been big in the past, but the delivery leaves a lot to be desired.
All right. VK Mishra, close the show for us with your concluding remark.
We should stop comparing China 10 times bigger economy than us. Even if we grow more than 1% or more than 1.5% than China, there is no comparison of these two economies. Number two, the most important part, we should welcome the steps taken by Mr. Xi. But at the same time, we need to be careful about our own production, our own house, how we are growing our export basket, how we are watching our investment from rest of the world. We
Sure.
should not mention that China is not able to invest in our country. We
All
should
right.
also compare in past 4 or 5 years how much investment came from other countries. Then it will be a reasonable comparison.
All right. On that note, then we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of the debate is that the decision of China to open up its markets is a welcome move. It remains to be seen whether or not China will follow through on its statement that it has made today. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.